I'm
Everybody
gonna
say
mute
a hot
and
mic. There we go.
You'll let me know, John?
You're ready, Rob.
Good. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the annual Galbraith Lecture. I'm Rob Greenwood, Associate Vice President, Public Engagement and External Affairs at Memorial University and Director of the Harris Center. And this is a Harris Center event we've held for many years now. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. And we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located this afternoon and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. The John Kenneth Galbraith Lectureship in Public Policy is an opportunity for Memorial to invite a nationally or internationally renowned speaker to discuss an issue of current interest. This year, we're taking the opportunity to present a slightly different format, Governing the Economy, Prospects for Government Action, goes to the heart of the Harris Center's public policy mandate. Given the challenging times in our province, we didn't think there was one particular individual who could present us with a complete understanding of the current situation. So instead, we've assembled a great panel of people, including economists, political scientists, former public servants, and entrepreneurs. And we've invited one of Canada's top political journalists and commentators to serve as moderator. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our great panel and moderator. Elizabeth Beale is an economist and has been an advisor to governments and industry on economic strategies for Atlantic Canada throughout her career. She was the president and CEO of the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council, APEC, from 1996 until her retirement in 2015. She has remained active in Canadian public policy as a commissioner of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission and as an associate of the Leslie Harris Centre for Regional Policy and Development. Most recently, she has been appointed to the newly established advisory board for the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Commission. David Freshwater is the Emeritus H.B. Price Professor of Agricultural Policy in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Kentucky and a former adjunct professor in the Geography Department at Memorial. He's a long-term consultant to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in Paris, and in 2009 was head of the OECD Rural Policy Program. He has also been a consultant to several other multinational organizations and to a number of government agencies in Canada and the US, including as a senior economist on the staff of the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress. Most importantly, he is a longtime collaborator with the Harris Center and has studied Newfoundland and Labrador for almost 20 years. David Vardy was trained in economics at Memorial University and holds a postgraduate degree from the University of Toronto and Princeton University. He served in a number of executive positions in the Newfoundland Public Service, including Clerk of Executive Council, President of the Marine Institute, Deputy Minister of Fisheries, and Chair of the Public Utilities Commission. He is former Director of the Public Policy Research Center and currently an Associate of the Harris Center. He's also a founding member of the Muskrat Falls Coalition of Concerned Citizens. He recently served as a member of the Premier's Economic Recovery Team. He's received the Lieutenant Governor's Award for Excellence in Public Administration, awarded by the Institute of Public Admin of Canada, IPAC, the Gold Medal Award for the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, and an honorary doctorate from Memorial for his contributions to public policy and governance. Kay Riggs is a graduate of Memorial's Commerce Program. She has over 30 years' experience working in rural industry and government positions related to regional economic development in Newfoundland and Labrador. She has managed everything from fish harvesting and secondary processing to a major local manufacturing operation in Grand Bank that produced products for global markets. Kay is also the former chair of the Harris Center Advisory Board. Kelly Bladuc is Associate Professor of Political Science at Memorial. His research focuses primarily upon Canadian Parliament and representative practices. He has written and co-authored several books on Canadian politics, and his academic research has appeared in various journals, including the Canadian Journal of Political Science, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Legislative Studies. And he's currently working on a book project that studies MPs in 4 countries. His political commentary has appeared in the National Post, the Ottawa Citizen, the Hill Times, the Independent, and the St. John's Telegram. And finally, our great homegrown moderator is David Cochrane. He's senior reporter with CBC's Parliamentary Bureau in Ottawa. For the past year, David has covered the federal government's pandemic response and vaccine procurement efforts for the National. He was one of CBC's lead reporters for the 2019 federal election campaign and has covered international summits such as the G7 and NATO. David is also a frequent guest host of CBC News Network's Power and Politics. Before relocating to Ottawa, David spent nearly 28 years in St. John's as the CBC's provincial affairs reporter. David is also a graduate of Memorial University and former news editor for The Muse. So great start here at Memorial. Before I turn things over to David, I want to give you a quick overview of the format for today's session. David Cochrane, and you'll have noted probably we have 3 Davids on our session, so David Cochrane can be careful on that as he goes. David Cochrane is going to kick things off for us and get the conversation going with the panelists. Then it will be your turn in the audience to ask questions. So get your thoughts together and feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the session. As always, we will be recording today's session and it will be posted online afterwards. And you can always find past Harris Center sessions on our YouTube channel and on our website. That's all from me for now. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Rob. I just wanted to say hello to everyone. It's been about 2 years since I've set foot on the island of Newfoundland and longer than 4 years since I was in Labrador. And so I jumped at the opportunity to come home, even if it's only virtually, because this week actually marks 5 years since I packed up my family and moved to the mainland to get a job. I was 43 years old when I finally left home. I had 1 kid, a second was on the way, and the plan was to stay in Ottawa for 2 years and then come back to St. John's. But as I said, that was 5 years ago. So it looks like plans have changed. In the nearly 20 years I worked as a reporter in Newfoundland and Labrador, I did many stories that were some version or another of the arse is out of her. And I did very few stories of the arse being put back in her. And I think there's reasons for that, because Newfoundland and Labrador has many profound structural challenges. It's structured like a province, but it's settled like a territory, and it's populated like a municipality. When you look at the math, there are just over 500,000 people in the province living in more than 600 communities. And those are spread out over the 16th largest island in the world, and then the vastness of Labrador. And you have a government that's challenged to provide 21st century services really across a pre-industrial settlement pattern based on a type of fishery that no longer exists. And the government has to do this while drawing funding from a shrinking and aging workforce and while riding the rogue waves of global commodity prices. And now there's Muskrat Falls, which could very well be the thing that takes the arse out of everything for good. So in my experience, a lot of people back home like to decry the status quo, but when it comes down to it, they don't seem to really want change. My sense is, and I think the truth is that change is inevitable at this point. It can either be chosen or it will be imposed because the financial burden could become too severe. You know, you'll remember that a little over a year ago, the provincial government found itself in a situation where it just couldn't borrow money on the bond markets. Dwight Ball, who was the premier at the time, he wrote the prime minister to say that the government was simply out of time, that the provincial government, if you could imagine, would be out of cash by mid-April. And they were exploring options to set up things like credit lines and credit facilities so that health authorities could borrow to pay nurses and pay doctors in the middle of a global pandemic. Ironically, it was the pandemic that saved them because the world went into lockdown. Absolutely everybody was crisis. Historic action was called for. And then the Bank of Canada stepped in and started buying provincial bonds. Interest rates were slashed to historic lows, and Newfoundland and Labrador had cash flow again. It's able to borrow now, but it may not stay this way forever because interest rates are going to eventually come up from those historic lows. And it may once again be too difficult or too expensive for the government to borrow, and another premier may have to write another prime minister to say that Newfoundland and Labrador is out of time once more. So how do we avoid that? That's the big question. What does Newfoundland and Labrador need to change in its political culture, in its government structure, in its approach to the economy to stop this endless and often repeated march to the brink? And those are some of the things that I really hope to explore in this session and to get answers from in this session. I want to start with Dave Freshwater on this point. Because, Dave, you're not from Newfoundland and Labrador, but you do have the fortune of working very closely with a lot of people from Newfoundland and Labrador, including Rob and the Harris Center and people like Alvin Sims, where you've been looking at things like labor markets and demographics in this province. So with that perspective, with this sort of removed perspective, once removed, what do you think has contributed to the current economic situation in the province? And what do you think is needed as a start to get the province out of this?
I just had to unmute myself. Thanks for the opportunity, Rob, and the rest of the Harris Center. And it's always great to be back in Newfoundland, even if it's virtual. I'm going to sort of up David's initial offering on the structural problems, and I'm going to put aside the government fiscal crisis and look at what I consider to be the fundamentals. I think there's really four big things that we could talk about. One of them is geography, as Dave highlighted. The second one is changing underlying economic conditions, which David also highlighted. The third thing is also something that David highlighted. So it's an inability to adapt. And that's one of the things that struck me about being in Newfoundland over the last 20 years. And the last thing is demographic decline, which is the elephant in the room for not just Newfoundland and Labrador, but just about for every country in the OECD, where demographic fertility rates are ranging from about 0.4 in Korea to barely above 2 in Canada and the United States in general, but with a large number of countries that are below the replacement rate, which means that first their labor force will shrink and then their population will shrink. And that's inevitable at this point in time, as near as I can tell. Okay, so geography. It's a small population in a large area with only one city, and that one city is awkwardly located. It's at one corner of the province. So it's remote, not just from the rest of North America, it's actually remote from the rest of Newfoundland and Labrador. Everybody is west of St. John's, just pretty much, and a significant distance from St. John's. And that connectivity is an important thing. The rest of the population's in small settlements, initially driven by the inshore cod fishery and water transport. Fisheries gone, roads have replaced water transport. Now all the places that were at the mouth of the bay so they could get to the fishery easily are a long way from the Trans-Canada Highway, which is the only road in the province, and that doesn't even cross the southern part of the province. So connectivity is horrible. Then turning to changing underlying circumstances, the fisheries have changed. The cod fishery is gone, shrimp, crab fishery picked up, but it's a different type of fishery, requires different skills, requires different capital levels. Forestry declined. Oil was doing really well, but has had a collapse. And this whole change in economic structure has hit all resource-dependent regions in the world. Some places have found an easier way to adapt, and Texas would be an interesting case. Texas because Texas went from traditional oil drilling to fracking and is pumping more oil than it ever did before. One of my favorite comparison places for Newfoundland and Labrador is North Dakota, which is a state with just over 700,000 people, big, remote, resource-based agriculture, but has done really well with fracking as well. For two cycles, the first one in the 70s and then again. And North Dakota faces all the same challenges the Newfoundland and Labrador does, for exactly the same reasons that it's a resource-dependent place. The one thing that I think you do have some control over is, and you haven't, province and the people in the province haven't done a wonderful job with this, is an inability to adapt. And I think there's an explanation for it, and the explanation lies in the nature of the economy from the time of the fishing admirals. That in resource extraction, there's very little incentive to think about the long term. Why are settlements in Newfoundland spread out? Well, they're spread out so every community has its own little fishing ground, and you don't have to worry about usurpers coming in and catching your fish. But every fisherman knows that a fish that I don't catch today, somebody else may catch, so I have an incentive to catch as many fish as I can, which leads to problems in fisheries management. Similarly, if the province owns all the trees, you don't have a strong incentive if you're harvesting timber to manage the forest in a sustainable way, because it's not your trees. You should cut the trees whenever you can get them, because somebody else may get the contract to cut the trees if you don't get them. And that leads to a short-term situation. The second big class in Newfoundland and Labrador has been the merchant class, mostly located in St. John's. And merchants behave in a very similar way to resource harvesters. Because for a merchant, if I don't sell something today, I might not sell it tomorrow. So in both cases, you have a society that becomes inherently driven by short-term behavior, rather than thinking about long-term investments. And it's not just Newfoundland and Labrador's like that. Alberta has suffered some of the same consequences. All the Middle East oil countries are like that. Argentina is the quintessential example of a country that 100 years ago was one of the wealthiest countries in the world because of its resource base, and is now a basket case. And it still has a huge resource base. It's not that they depleted their resources, they depleted their ability to adjust to a changing environment and have never managed to get it back. And then the last thing that I think is crucial is that the governments in many ways have enabled this short-term behavior. And the quintessential example in the province is seasonal EI. Seasonal EI locks people into low-wage, part-time activities. Fish plants into not adapting to new technologies because their wages, worker wages, are subsidized. So they're perfectly happy to hire low productivity workers because they only pay part of the wage. The government pays the rest of it through the seasonal EI program. The province has also been involved in this by providing grants to communities and playing an outsized role in the province. And the APEC has talked about that in the past. And I think that problem is the one thing that you really can control. And then the last part is demographic decline, and we know all about that. So that, as David said, change is inevitable because the number of people in the province is not going to get larger in any time soon, and is probably going to get smaller as people continue to migrate, especially if economic opportunity disappears.
Okay,
My short.
David, that's a lot to think about right off the top. The inability to adapt is certainly a phrase that sticks out for me. All right, I want to move now to Kay Riggs if I can. And Kay, you've been an entrepreneur and a government economic development person working mostly in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. It's your mission. You've made it your mission to keep business thriving in rural parts of the province, which is a difficult task. I think everybody knows. So, I mean, what do you think about what Dave had to say about the dynamics of rural economics, and in particular, the specific challenges of declining labor supply and population overall?
Well, the declining labor supply is very real. I mean, I'm seeing it in the business that I worked for the past 12 years in other industries. So, you know, the out-migration, the young people leave, and then trying to attract skilled people, experienced business people to the rural areas. You have to have education, healthcare, connectivity, recreation. If you've got, it doesn't have to be, at the same level you would find in a city like St. John's, but it has to be able to cover basic needs. So it's a real challenge, but I think what it can do is force companies to adapt and use technology. And David's point on, companies' inability to adapt. Look, I've worked in a couple of areas where worked in the fishing industry back in the 70s and 80s, wet fish processing, and then, 700 people on the payroll. And then we went into value-added secondary processing with 100 people on the payroll. So there's a big shift, and those other people were left by the wayside. But when I look at many of them now, 25 or 30 years later, they did adapt, retrained, went to work in oil and gas, Newfoundland and Alberta. And the business I worked in Grand Bank, it was all the raw materials were imported, all the product was exported. When the company set up there in 2004, we hired people that had been displaced in the fishing industry. They had no experience in that business, but with some training and a desire to stay and live in rural Newfoundland, they did, and it was a very successful company. It still is a very successful company. So, but I think it takes a lot of effort and a lot of focus, and the rewards are not in 3 years. It's a slow build, 3, 5, 7 years. The resources need to be, the people with the vision and the capital. And I think some of the government investments in training need to be within workplaces, not just general training that you would find in some of the, universities and colleges. Did I answer?
So like business specific training rather than broad-based retraining. If an industry or company wants to set up in a town such as Grand Bank or Marystown, come in with training specific to that company, that level of support, is that what you mean there?
That's what I'm thinking, because the industry in Grand Bank that I worked in, the type of skills we needed, you couldn't find it in the college. There's probably only 3 companies in Newfoundland that use the type of equipment and technology. So the colleges weren't turning out classes every 6 months or even every year. So we had to develop training programs and deliver them in-house with support from the college and others. So I think we need to look at, if we're going to attract some business in here, value added, and recognize that the training will most likely have to be done on the shop floor.
Okay, that brings us to our next speaker. That's Dr. Kelly Bladuc, and because Kelly, a lot of what Kay is talking about, there are choices that politicians and governments might have to make, and you have a unique perspective on this panel as a political scientist and also a guy not named David. So we want to bring you in on this part and ask you, what role do you think the health of our politics and our democratic system plays in the current situation?
Well, I guess not surprisingly, I think it plays a big role. There seems to be this idea, and we've talked about it before, this idea sometimes in Newfoundland and Labrador, and whether it exists beyond sort of the politics, but certainly it exists in politics and government. It's this idea that you don't necessarily need to do things properly to get a good outcome. And sometimes it seems like a guiding principle. There's a lot of problems that stem from this inability to have processes in place that you can trust to get you to the desired place. And so cutting corners on processes when possible, this is something that it happens in government, it happens in the public service. I think citizens and the media actually allow it. Every time a democratic issue comes up, there's this sort of rolling over to just let whomever's in charge do what they want to do. If we talk about political culture specifically, political culture in Newfoundland is probably best understood sort of in traditional terms as what's known as a subject culture, which is one where citizens see themselves as separate from government. Government is one thing, citizens are another. They don't really see themselves as kind of being part of the same thing. And that's a big problem. And then we have, I think more recent conceptualizations in political culture would also maybe consider us a collectivist culture. And that's one where there aren't really deep or dangerous divisions. You can imagine situations where people might want to go to war with the people they live with. And thinking back to what David Freshwater was talking about before, there's still this, there's definitely a competition amongst citizens in the economic realm, and I think in the political realm too, but we don't have these deep and dangerous divisions. But people just aren't engaged. I know that people in Newfoundland and Labrador think that they participate in politics, and you hear sayings about how they love politics, they love talking about politics, but there's very little evidence of a mature or an engaged political culture. And so, for me, I realize this is a hobby horse. I'm sorry if I'm that guy, but we've watched this recently play out where where it was unclear if there was, with various aspects of our most recent election, whether they were even conducted properly. But the government declared victory and just proceeded. Media woefully unprepared, citizens woefully unprepared, ill-informed on what to do, ill-informed on what's occurred since. And we literally have court cases now that will essentially determine whether or not we had a proper election, rather than having government or anybody else kind of care about it and do something about it. And just to kind of make the point, these cases could be career defining for lawyers. These are cases that may well instruct our understanding of our right to vote under the Charter as Canadians. And two of those candidates are defending themselves in court. So while I'm at it, I'll just say boo to the legal community too. It's disheartening. And I'll quote Dr. Seuss, unless someone cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. I feel, as someone who observes politics in this province, that there's a lot to do. And without that foundation of empowering citizens and in turn empowering government, making them work together, think of themselves as one thing, I don't see how you address all these other issues which are related to governance.
I wanted to touch on something we hear, if I could, Kelly, and that's what you talked about during the Muskrat Falls inquiry, because David Vardy is next, and I can't go to David Vardy without first talking about Muskrat Falls. And to me, it is a moment in the province's history that speaks to the manifest weakness of institutions, the challenge function of the civil service, the fact that a generational defining project was exempted from the Public Utilities Board, run out of a largely exempt from scrutiny and oversight super crown corporation, and really removed from any kind of proper process that a project of such magnitude should have undergone. And since I've come here, you see a public sector where the challenge function is much stronger. The watchdogs have louder barks, sharper teeth, and tougher to leash. And you have a critical mass of media, and it's not perfect, but there is a greater level of oversight and accountability. And one of the things you highlighted in the Muskrat Falls inquiry was the inability of politicians to civil servants to speak truth to power. And I just wonder how much does that play into all of this?
Yeah, so I think we saw that play out on a grand scale with Muskrat Falls. But yeah, what I found, in doing that study was that, there was people who were going between departments and saying that the practices for documentation were different. If you talk, they'd say, there's guidelines, there's training. It's all supposed to be crystal clear, but you go from one department to another and it's completely different. So I think there's that sort of thing. I think there's still a fair bit of kind of doing things the way that people within certain structures want to do them. And so we saw this, and also, a very common element of that whole bit of research was people saying things like, do you want it to end up on the front page of the Telegram? It's a very common way of basically saying, don't write things down. I'd be fair too. We just had the report come out today, which I haven't had a chance to look at. It's apparently almost 600 pages for sort of recommendations to update the regulations with the access to information and protection of privacy. And so it's not perfect. Implementation is not the only problem with the regulations that we have. But I think, more broadly, the issues that we see are that people there are systems in place that make it difficult for people to do the job properly, to document what they're doing properly, to enhance transparency where we should probably have it. And beyond that, I think it also lends itself to often policy expertise being being overlooked in order to pursue a given outcome, to figure out what it is that we want to do. Now let's, to the extent we need to, incorporate the processes that are there. But if we can cut corners, if we can get bad process and still get the outcomes we want, then let's do that. So I guess it comes back around. I mean, for me, certainly studying that and seeing what happened with Muskrat Falls, it all speaks to a significant problem that does come back to, can we govern ourselves properly, and do we have the structures in place that we trust? Can we do this in a, I talk about democracy, but can we do this in a way we're actually following proper processes to get things, or are we just going to kind of one-off, do things poorly, and hope at the end of the day we're right? Because why wouldn't we be right this one time?
Okay, it seems like a good point to bring in Dave Vardy, who I think a lot of people realize probably was right in the long Muskrat Falls conversation that the province had. And Dave, you've been a top public servant throughout your career, including as a clerk of the Executive Council, and your public service has continued long after your retirement. So I wonder, does what Kelly had to say about the limited ability of public servants to sort of do that challenge function and maybe speak truth to power internally, does your experience reflect that?
David, thanks for the opportunity. Certainly, I concur with what my colleagues on the panelists have been saying. I certainly agree with what David Freshwater has talked about in terms of fundamental problems in the Newfoundland economy. But I do believe that you go up to 30,000 feet, you look at where we are, look at our adaptability, look at our capital resources, our financial resources, our natural resources. We have a lot of things going for us. We have a very strong potential. A big problem, I think, is really in our governance. I think when you look at it over the years, we've had a number of studies. I've been involved the last couple of years in the Muskrat Falls inquiry as a member of the coalition, and we were there every day asking questions pro bono. And then over the last year, I've been involved with the Premier's Economic Recovery Commission. We're asking questions, we're looking at where the economy is going, and really fundamentally assessing the big issues. And I think the biggest problem of all relates to how we govern ourselves. And I was interested with the comment that Kelly made about the report coming out today about freedom of information, because that's the point that I would want to focus on. I would want to focus on, and I want to reinforce the comment that Kelly made about the alienation between the community, the private citizens, and the people that govern the province. They're like two solitudes. We have two solitudes. We have the people, we have the government, it's government. The people tend not to think of themselves as part of the community. We're operating, so we think about the government as something that could do things to help us. We don't think about what we can do to help the government. But I want to focus on two things. One is measurement. One of the biggest principles of management, whether it's public sector or private sector management, is you can't manage what you cannot measure. And one of the things that's happened, it's come out of these inquiries, is a lot of information that's come out. We've discovered just how big our public sector debt is. We've measured it. It's $47 billion. We were kidding ourselves to believe that net debt of the province is $15 billion. Now we're saying that the full public debt is a much bigger number. And so that's big information. We discovered a lot of information when David mentioned about the PUB being taken out of the PUB, out of the Muskrat Falls inquiry, or the jurisdiction taken away, and but there was a review done by the Public Utilities Board, and there was a lot of good information that came out of that. We would not have gotten that information otherwise. Problem is that governments don't have the information they need. Citizens certainly don't. And these inquiries are providing information that we don't have. Now, we do have relatively good freedom of information legislation in this province, but there's a move afoot to try to water it down. And I think that's a big danger. I think it's very important that citizens have access to information. And it was Judge Louis Brandeis who said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And what he was meaning to say was that you really need to have good information. You need to have good government. You need to have transparent government. You need to have access to information. The budget document that came out a week or so ago I looked at it and I compared the numbers in it to the numbers that we had in the PERT report, and they're vastly different numbers. And government operates on the basis of two different metrics. One is called a cash budget, the other is called accrual budget. Very confusing. I won't get into the technicalities, but the budget is not a very transparent document, and so there's a role there. And I think that the university has a role. The Harris Center has been doing some good work with a project called Vital Signs. Vital Signs is what kind of information do we need to measure our progress as a society? And I think that's where we need to focus, is because I think that if we have better information, more timely information, we may be able to deal with this gap, the alienation between the citizen, the private citizen, and the government that serves us. And I think, and the other thing is this, the culture of the public service. Well, I spent most of my career as a senior public servant. And we always were mindful back in my day. I've been out of government for 20 years. The citizen is the ultimate customer. What's happened over the last 20 years is there's been a centralization of government, and senior public servants are focusing on making their political masters happy. And that's not their role. Their role is not to make them, their role is to serve the public. And they're losing sight of that, because I think what's happening is we've lost the sight. We're not looking at the ball, and the ball is service to the public. And that's why we're not measuring the quality of service. We're not focusing on the quality of service. We're not providing continuous information to the public, which we should be doing. And we're relying on these sporadic commissions, Royal Commissions, the Young Royal Commission, the Green Inquiry, the Muskrat Falls Inquiry, because our system is broken, it's not working. We're not providing proper communications. University has a role here, but it's got to be pervasive. There have to be major changes in the institutions so that the Public Utilities Board is more transparent, so the Department of Finance is more transparent, so that government operates in a more transparent process. Because I think we're making big mistakes, we're making bad decisions because we don't give the information the public needs to the citizens so the citizens can make informed choices. So I think those are the main points I would like to make at this point, David.
Yep, and Dave, it certainly seems like every decade or so, there's another review of the access to information legislation. I remember the old conservative governor, I believe it was Kathy Dunderdale was premier at the time, Bill 29, when they were making big changes to access to information, rolling things back. And journalists and others went to the ramparts to stop it because it was a problem. And it's an even more fundamental challenge now with the way social media pollutes the information ecosystem, and with the challenges that local newsrooms are having all across the Western world, but acutely in Newfoundland and Labrador, where ownership of key voices has moved outside the province, and further restrictions on information flow will be very problematic. All right, David, thank you for that. I want to bring in Elizabeth Beale now, if I can. And Ms. Beale, I know you have done a lot of work looking at the economic ups and downs of Newfoundland and Labrador, and looking at them in comparison to other parts of Canada, the Atlantic provinces in particular. So what lessons or models do you see in other parts of Canada? If it's not a blueprint maybe for recovery, it's at least a roadmap to start fixing things for Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm just so intrigued by some of the comments that have come forward from the other panelists. I have to say at the start that I'm perhaps less gloomy than some of the others about the prospects for the province. I really think that many of the challenges around the geographic distribution of the population, which is of course not just an issue for this province, but for much of Canada's population outside of the 80% who live in city environments, are starting to disappear as technology becomes so much better transmitted, not just through broadband, but eventually through satellites. So we have a chance to, the pandemic's been an exercise in how we might work and communicate and live differently than perhaps we've always thought we had to live. So on the big issues around, the enormous changes that we're seeing in technological advance and electrification in particular, and how that's a boost to many of Newfoundland's mining industries, and long run potential around the assets of hydro development, the province, I think, has enormous potential to both contribute to and be part of the kind of revolution that we're seeing at the moment on the environmental and the climate change side, and also on the technology side. Nevertheless, it has an enormous burden in terms of, as Dave Vardy pointed to, the enormous debt that has been built up, not just through Muskrat Falls, but through that contribution of that project in particular, and also the fact that the province has been running an ongoing deficit well in excess of its ability to finance that level of expenditures. And that has to be, the province has to focus on that as a top priority. The federal government will be a partner through helping to manage the debt and through stabilization policies. But nevertheless, this is the province's top priority at the moment. And many other provinces have had to deal with very closely related challenges throughout their history and have brought in a number of mechanisms. My concern at the moment is that the province has to narrow down those priorities and really figure out where it's going to really make things stick. If governance is, its biggest challenge to completely redo the governance of all leading institutions, and I mean healthcare, the schools, the Crown Corps, is an enormous challenge. Where does it put its immediate priorities on that front, and how can it leverage the strengths that we're now seeing in the corporate community on the governance side, as they start to realize they have to think much more broadly about the role of stakeholders and priorities, not just about investors. So how can we, corporations are developing a much better understanding of the priorities for governance and how you have to bring capable individuals in with that kind of understanding of the task. This is not just a matter anymore of appoint somebody from every relevant sector to sit on the board and hope for the best. You've got to make sure that those individuals who are involved in governance, whether it's institutions or whether it's community organization, really can make a contribution to improving the outcomes and helping that institution to set its priorities. One of the mechanisms that I have been involved in a couple of provinces that I think is the best, a very good model for success, is to appoint independent commissions that can help to bridge the reporting. Dave Vardy was talking about the importance of information, both Dave and Kelly, and to give individuals confidence that government not just has the right priorities, but is helping to make progress on the metrics and the success of achieving those priorities. And that's not just, as Dave pointed out, the role for episodic commissions. That's a body that will stick with government and play an independent role on reporting back the success that they are making on achieving those priorities to citizens. And I think that's absolutely the way Newfoundland should go when it has such enormous big challenges that it's facing at the current time.
Okay, Elizabeth, thank you very much for that. I just want to let everyone know we're going to do one more quick round of questions, springboarding off, I think, the more positive outlook from Elizabeth Beale there than perhaps from some others on the panel. But we want to remind people that we're going to be opening up the audience questions in a little bit as well. So please submit your questions in the Q&A function. You can see that at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Kathy Newhook is going to pull all of these together, and we're going to start posing those to our panelists shortly. But I want to pick up on Elizabeth's point there about a more positive outlook and speaking about the potential that exists in Newfoundland and Labrador. And Dave Freshwater, if I can come back to you on this, I've been hearing about the potential of the place my whole life. I believe in the potential of the place. I moved away, not because I didn't want the place to succeed, but because of opportunities that presented themselves. When you look at the larger political and economic ecosystem of Newfoundland and Labrador, if there's one sort of thing you could recommend to help unlock that potential that Elizabeth speaks of, what would it be?
put that into a bit of a context. I think there's two things that are happening everywhere in the world, including in the province. The first one is that technological change is inevitably reducing the demand for certain kinds of labor. We really see that in the resource industries, that it just takes far fewer people to cut trees, to harvest grain, to catch fish, to extract oil than it did in the past. So there's a decreasing demand for a lot of workers. On the other hand, we know that demographic decline is going to reduce the number of workers coming into the system. So whether that turns into a disaster or an opportunity hinges crucially on something that Kay talked about, which is you've got to have people investing in new kinds of businesses, and you've got to have upskilling of the labor force. And upskilling is more than just spending an extra couple of years in school. It's actually acquiring skills that are useful in some sort of private sector establishment, because the private sector carries the bulk of the economy, and government is good at many things, but creating jobs that generate wealth is not one of them. And I think there's clearly an opportunity in the province, and Kate talked about places that have done that. The question is, how do you go about doing more of that so it's not just isolated entrepreneurs, angel investors, that it's something systemic? And there are regions in different parts of the world, parts of Quebec, parts of Spain, parts of Scotland, parts of Poland, places that I've been to, where you see there's a culture in the community that supports entrepreneurial behavior, because most entrepreneurs fail early on. Mm-hmm. Question is, are they laughed at because they failed, or are they encouraged to do it again? Because often it's the second or third time that you get it right. And does the community see that as something that is good for that particular place? And I think this is less about, future hinges less on economic opportunities than on the willingness of people to seize those opportunities and take advantage of them. And that's more the broader sociology of the places than the economic fundamentals that it sees itself in.
Well, Kay, I wonder if you can pick up on that. I mean, what is one thing you see that could really sort of make a difference in increasing the chances of success for economic opportunity and just prosperity in a lot of the community where you live and where you've tried to unlock economic potential in the past?
I mean, it takes like a whole cross section of support. What I saw in the industries I worked in, you know, there was government support in education for training, and it has to be individualized. And like, there are people who are quite willing to work in various industries, and that allows them to live in the community where, you know, they grew up or where they've relocated to in recent years. But the training needs to be tailored to the business and to the individual. So, you know, I think we need to look at what can we do within a region. And just to go back to one of the points the other panelists on, you know, you have provincial governments, you have municipal governments. The municipal governments look after water, sewer, and roads, pretty much. There's nobody looking after, you know, regional economics. So if we had regions that were like ecosystems, you've got some economy in the natural resources, you got some in manufacturing, value added. And, you know, if a region can be sustaining and make a contribution, I think that's kind of how we need to look at it. The geography of Newfoundland is so great, and we are all not going to move to the Northeast Avalon, but it's not on. So we have to find ways to be able to have opportunities for people to have meaningful work more than 10 or 15 weeks a year. Like, young people particularly are not at all interested in 10 or 15 weeks of work. They want full-time, meaningful well-paying jobs. So I think we just got to get our heads around how do we do that and how do we do it. You know, there'll be some experiments that'll be like entrepreneurs. Some of it won't work. And just because we fail once, don't mean we shouldn't try again. If I look at the person I work with in the business in Grand Maple was an entrepreneur. I think he failed about 3 times before he says he made enough mistakes so that he could get it right. So I think we got to change attitudes on entrepreneurship as well.
Okay, thanks for that. I know you talked about sustaining regions and prosperous regions and regional development. I know David Freshwater's done work on regional governments, and I know this is something that's talked about in the Newfoundland and Labrador context, and we may pick up on that. But I want to go to Kelly first, and Kelly, I want to pick up on something Dave Freshwater said about looking at other examples, and he went through a list of other countries that have successful models or different models for dealing with, say, rural sustainability. Do we look outside Newfoundland and Labrador enough for ideas and solutions? Because one of the strengths of the place is it's an island, and so people pull together. One of the weaknesses is that it's an island, and it tends to be isolated physically and sometimes to ideas, is my experience there. I mean, is that something that needs to change if any of this is going to work?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so I would say, just in the time that I've lived here, I of course didn't grow up in Newfoundland and Labrador. I've only been here, I guess I'm coming up on 14 years though. So, a reasonable amount of time. I think that I've actually seen some change. I think I've seen some change in lots of things. And so I guess my first point in trying to be positive, because I know I'm not usually a very positive person, is that change occurs. Change is usually slow and change is usually hard. And people need to accept that as opposed to thinking, how can we fix things by next year? But I guess, yeah, going to your question, which is about just, an openness to how things can work, a knowledge of. So I'd connect both your question and just one other point, if I can quickly. I think that we need to always be open to the fact that there's a high likelihood that we can be wrong. I've had to learn this, you've had to learn this. I think everybody actually still kind of partly needs to learn this. Just because there's a way that you want to do things, or just because somebody isn't, from here, these should not be sort of primary reasons to discount something, right? So I do think, I think we should always be looking at examples. This is not an area of strength for me in terms of the economies and so on. So I can't really give you specific examples to look at, but absolutely. I mean, part of what we should be doing should be openness, and it should also be around sort of knowledge and education. And so I guess just to bounce off where I thought we were kind of going in terms of maybe some solutions. For me personally, obviously, I look at the Democratic Foundation. I look at a lot of people fighting for reforms. I think of the system as a castle, and I see a lot of people firing their cannons at the flags at the castle rather than firing them at the foundation. And I think the foundation is really where if you want some kind of long-term difference, you need to aim. For me personally, I think that a lot of this comes down to education. I know that's an easy go-to, but quite frankly, if it was being done better, it wouldn't be the first thing to go to. I think we need more robust education, civics education. Personally, I would go a little further. I know none of this will ever happen because it doesn't stabilize any particular political party, and it doesn't give them more votes in the short term. I would have a very robust system of education, grade 10, 11, 12, and I would lower the voting age, and I would get people learning and voting while they're in high school, bring the polling stations to the high schools, get people so that they engage and then they see the outcome, and that's part of the curriculum if possible, so that it's not some weird abstract thing. People have this idealist sense that, first of all, they think government's horrible, but I also have this idealist sense that the people who should be in government should be unpaid, perfect people who only think about the public good. And I think that at some point, much earlier, we need to connect people and say, no, government is you. It's not other people. It's not these unicorns that you can't actually identify. It's you. And I think that anything we can do to start working on that now will build a foundation that hopefully 20 years from now, 30 years from now, will really make some strides.
Yep, I completely agree with you. I've long believed that 16 should be the voting age. So if you're old enough to move out, you're old enough to work, you're old enough to get a job and start paying tax, you should have something to say. And I've long held the same belief as you that earlier engagement is better engagement. The tobacco companies learned that. We should apply it to democracy and get people voting early. All right, Kelly, I want to move on now to Dave Vardy to get his thought on this. And Dave, I know you must have some positive outlook here, because I can't imagine you would have taken on all of these post-retirement projects for change and trying to help the province if you didn't have a positive outlook on things. So what are the things that you think could be implemented to help improve the situation here in Newfoundland and Labrador?
I think there are lots of good things we could do. I think we have a lot of opportunity. I see a lot of entrepreneurship around us now. There's good things here. Main thing is to focus from an industrial standpoint on the long term, not on the short term, because we do spend far too much time, too much resources on short-term jobs. We've got to look at the long term. The fishery we can't ignore the fishery. The fishery was the backbone, and we need to restore the fishery. And that means better science. It means more attention to rebuilding fish stocks. I think that's very important, because with the oil and gas has been such a bonanza for us. It's taken our eye off the ball of the fishing industry. The other thing I would mention is the whole question of immigration. I think immigration and investment immigration, there are a lot of people who can come here, bring their skills, bring their money, bring their investment. I think those are the kinds of things we could be doing. Going back to the public service, the public sector is very large. We need to make the public sector more efficient, more quality conscious, and more cost conscious. So what I would like for us to see is when we get medical treatment, we go to the hospital, we get surgery, whatever, we should see what it's costing. We should know what it's costing. The same when we go to the Best Buy to buy a television, we should know how much it's going to cost. We should know if we have a surgery done, if I have cataracts done, which I did a year ago, I should know, even if I don't have to pay for it, I should know how much it costs, and I should know what it should cost. I have some sense of what it should cost in a good, well-run healthcare system. So what I think we need to do is to move our public sector towards more transparency, more cost competitive situation where taxes are as low as they can be, because we're keeping our services efficient, low cost, but high quality. So we need to monitor the quality. We need to monitor the cost. We need to have more consciousness. And I think citizens need to be involved in monitoring, in a citizens council, which is looking at costs, looking at what's happening, what are the most pertinent information, data for managing our economy. What kind of information do citizens need in order to participate meaningfully in democracy? I think that there's a lot of things we can do to make our governance a lot better than it is.
Okay, Dave, thanks for that. And Elizabeth, I'd like to end this with you, as you're the one who sort of started with the positive outlook and wanted to hear, I guess I guess everybody wanted to hear some positive ideas for the place. Let's face it, we're not here to be a doomsday cult. But I'm wondering if you have any reflections on what people said there, and if there's an idea or a concept that you wanted to throw into the mix.
Well, I'm still feeling positive. I just want you to know that right off the bat. And in part, it's in part because I have worked, throughout my career in Atlantic Canada. This has been a slow growing part of Canada, while things were zooming ahead in many other regions of the country. And so we have always sort of hung back and said, we can't quite make it. I don't see that. And in fact, there's so many very dynamic companies in Newfoundland and Labrador, some of the new ones that have come along in the technology side and the financial services or ocean engineering, who are world-class companies. So I see that inability to adapt and be leaders. And as Kay said, you've got to fail 3 times sometimes before you actually make a success in whatever field that is. And so the private sector is good on understanding risks and learning from the risks. Government, not so much. And governments get penalized for taking risks and lose the next election. So the governments have to, even in the current dynamic government, the provincial government has to think about the growth agenda, and it has to leverage that potential from the private sector in terms of creating the environment that can allow that innovative side of Newfoundland's economy, whether it comes in the resource or the services, to flourish. But the other point I'll make is there's a group that we're not talking about here, and it was Kelly rather, who gave me a great idea from your Dr. Seuss quote, Kelly, about who we should be caring about the most. That's what government really should be thinking about. We get very stuck on our aging population, which of course is a characteristic of mature economies everywhere. And I don't think we think nearly enough about children and young families and those who are coming into the labor force because they're our future. About 20% of the population are under the age of 18, and another 28,000 are in that critical 20 to 24 age group. That's the group who we really need to focus on. There's some recognition that government needs to do more in terms of improving the quality of the education system. I'd go an awful lot further than that. I'd look at what mechanisms can be put in place to raise the 20% of children who still living under the poverty line, because it's so difficult for them then to achieve success in through the school system and into the labor force. I'd be looking at what innovative measures could be done with small tax credits, with support for young families on the childcare side, everything that we can do. That's the future of the province. And everything that we're doing should be geared at making sure that group succeeds. Immigration is fine in terms of diversifying the population, absolutely, but the core focus should be on our young people.
No, I think you make a really good point there. I mean, to go back to my opening remarks, how we came here 5 years ago to stay here for 2 years, one of the big reasons we stayed was opportunity. I mean, not for me and my wife, but for our kids. We have 2 boys now, 7 and 4, and the opportunities for families in Ottawa, it is the primary focus of the municipal government here to make it a family-friendly place, because it's a population driver and it brings people here in a critical mass. And to your point, the 2 dominant and most expensive political constituencies in Newfoundland and Labrador are seniors and the public service. And it becomes very difficult to deal with that on a structural basis when that critical mass exists. But I think you make a good point. If I was advising a premier right now, and I'm not, it would be to focus on families and young people and make it easier for women in particular to unleash their economic potential as a way of fixing Newfoundland and Labrador. All right, Elizabeth, thank you for ending on that point. We're going to open things up now, I think, to questions from the audience and cycle back to the panel. And Kathy, I think you have the first question for us to get this section started.
I do, yeah. This question is from Dean Bavington. He asks, what can the Newfoundland and Labrador political economy and governance learn from the Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit nations?
Okay, that's an interesting one there. Kelly, do you want to start there? Would you like to start us off on that one?
I wish I had a lot that I could say of what we could learn. I mean, as a political observer, I see the difficulties that we have in terms of reconciliation and properly incorporating those viewpoints. But I do not have expertise in this area to say these are the things specifically that we can learn. These are the things that they have for us. So I'm going to have to pass. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll try. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, Kelly.
No, it's okay.
I know academics like to stay in their lane when they can. Can I throw that open to the panel? Is there someone who wants to speak specifically on that, or can speak specifically? Go ahead, Dave.
Can I just jump in on this one? I see you're muted.
No, I can hear you, pal. Go right ahead, David. We can hear you loud and clear. The floor is yours.
I had the opportunity to work on an Indigenous people study with the OECD about 3 years ago. And we spent some time with Micmac Reserve near Truro and with the Iroquois people near Montreal. And the thing that I found really fascinating in both these cases was both groups were incredibly entrepreneurial. And both groups were engaged with the larger society. And I think while trying to maintain their community. So I think the lessons that I saw from that were that there was community engagement both within the bands and there was engagement beyond the bands to the surrounding communities to try and find ways to turn the situation into a positive something for everybody. And that was by sharing services, by trying to find ways to connect youth in the Indigenous community into opportunities off the reserve. And that was a positive experience for me.
Okay, anyone else on that one? Or Kathy, do you have another question if nobody wants to jump in? Okay, Kathy, you got another one for us?
I do, yep. Brian Eddy asks, there is no question Newfoundland and Labrador is struggling now, but it has always struggled financially since Confederation. How much of our current situation can be attributed to our initial conditions and an unfair deal with Canada? So should there be some sort of adjustment from Canada to assist with this financial crisis?
Okay, Dave Barty, I'm going to get you to lead off on that. I know there are conversations happening at the First Minister's table to fix things like the Fiscal Stabilization Fund, which would help resource-dependent provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, Saskatchewan, and Alberta deal with sort of the rise and fall of revenues. There's a lot of discussion about equalization. But I wonder if you can pick up on that, because it seems to me the financial situation right now is kind of a result of the spending spree during the oil boom years, and then the double whammy of Muskrat Falls. What's your sense of where things are, Dave Barty?
Yeah, thanks, David. The way I see it is, looking at it from an equalization standpoint, is there's been a problem in the way we deal with oil revenues. Oil revenues are, the federal government's not treating oil revenues the way they should be, because they're factoring it into the equalization programs, dealing with it as if it were like income tax revenue, sales tax revenue. This is a non-renewable resource. It's a depleting resource. It's capital. It's capital. The provincial government's been taking this money, putting it into its current account. So I think that there needs to be a complete revamp of how non-renewable resource revenue needs to go into the equalization formula, number one. And number two, how the province treats non-renewable. And I think what we've got to do is the Norwegian model. Now, Norway is not a federal state. It's a unitary state. What they've done is they've created the Heritage Fund, as you know, and they wouldn't take their current account and put it in. Well, what we got to do is make sure that we don't, because we're being penalized now. We're being penalized because of the fact that our oil revenues have been very good. And what's happened to us is what was virtually certain to happen. We became too dependent on it. We became too dependent on the oil. We lost the equalization. I think there needs to be an accord that treats natural resource revenues differently.
But Dave, has that ship sailed a little bit now in creating things like the Sovereign Wealth Fund that Norway put in place? Because we're sort of past the peak oil threshold in Newfoundland and Labrador. And let's face it, you look at where the world is going with pledges to decarbonize by 2050. It seems like the next couple of oil projects to get done could very well be the last. So, I mean, can the focus really be on dealing with oil revenues or just making better decisions domestic?
In tomorrow's world, David, I think what you're going to see is mineral revenues are going to be much more valuable. The rare earths, the lithium, other rare earths are going to be very high royalties associated with those. Those are going to be the new oil. Mm-hmm. So same issue is going to arise. I think we need to deal with that issue, the issue of non-renewable. And mineral revenue is just as non-renewable as oil revenue.
No, that's a very good point, especially with the push for electric vehicles and batteries, and certainly joint initiatives between President Biden and the Prime Minister to make Canada center on that. So Elizabeth Beale, I wonder if we can bring you in on this. I mean, you have studied a lot of with the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council. I mean, what are your thoughts on the issues raised in this particular question, and about whether it is, in fact, the relationship with the federal government that plays an outsized role in this?
Yeah, I certainly don't think I would go all the way back to Confederation. And in fact, if you went back further, there were many challenges long before that. but I do think that it is time to have a discussion about how to change the recognition of resource revenues, because several provinces, as you pointed out in Canada, are all facing the same kind of challenges. The scope is different in all those provinces, but we need to think about this differently. And it is a very, of course, divisive question politically for the federal government. So it's a discussion that's fraught with enormous economic and also political tensions. And this ongoing discussion of what's in and out of the equalization formula has dominated discussions between departments of finance provincially and federally for all of my working life. So I don't think there is a magic bullet on this, but I do think that there will be changes in terms of the stabilization measures on this to kind of smooth out the pattern over time. Although I honestly can't say when that will come about.
Kelly, you want to give quick final thoughts on this before we move on to the next round?
I guess just really quickly in relation to that part of this is connected to equalization and the degree to which I think people in Newfoundland and Labrador feel, given our circumstances, that we've sort of deserved it all this time. And I think there's probably even an argument to be made that given the unique circumstances of the province, maybe the formula for determining that should be different. I would bring this around partly, though, to the fact that one of the reasons that Newfoundland and Labrador is in the difficult position it is, but doesn't receive equalization, is because our tax capacity is actually quite high. We actually do have relatively strong income levels, even though we also have relatively large unemployment levels. I just wanted to quickly kind of make the point and kind of add to this a little bit to say that while there might be arguments that at least in that sense that the federal government should be doing more, I think it also kind of adds in a little bit back to the fact that Newfoundland and Labrador has actually done reasonably well, that a number of people have done quite well financially under the circumstances, but somehow we haven't managed to get our house in order in terms of governing ourselves.
Okay. Nope. The shrug of the shoulders, that could be put on the new coat of arms that I know that the Premier is talking to people about. All right, Kathy, do you want to come in with the next question there?
Sure. This one is from Lynn Gambin. And she writes, on the concept of upskilling, there is a need for sound labor market information and forecasting, along with distillation of that information to young people and those already in the labor force to see the opportunities on the horizon and potential career paths. What role, if any, might you see for government in producing this labor market information, or through what mechanisms could you see this information being created and disseminated and acted on in providing and supporting new or augmented education and training programs?
Okay, I know you've talked about labor pool challenges and the idea for specialized and micro-targeted training. Do you have any thoughts on that question?
Just thinking of some of the tools that I've used over the past 20 years in helping my kids try and determine, like, where are the jobs when, they're graduating high school, and what do you want to be when you grow up? So I think, there are some publications. It used to be Service Canada would put it out. There's some publications with the provincial government as well. But what I found was best was to go talk to people in the industry. So, 20 years ago, when my son said, I want to work offshore and I want to be a mechanic, it's like, okay, so what opportunities are there? So you go talk to people and in that industry. And I think we need to do more of that and then bring that back. And I'm sure the university and colleges are doing some of it. And then bring that back and train people for the jobs of the future. And keeping in mind that some of the jobs of the future will be in rural areas and they'll be different. So we have to have the opportunity for uniqueness when it comes to training. One size doesn't fit all, customized training.
Dave Freshwater, I know you've done a lot of work on labor markets here in Newfoundland and Labrador. I say here, I'm in Ottawa, but in Newfoundland and Labrador. And you mentioned that the sort of the the negative circle of population decline leading the labor market decline, and then sort of combining the acceleration. So when you listen to the points raised by the questioner, what role do you think there is here for the government to maybe help refine the labor market opportunities and steer people there? And if they can't make it bigger, maybe make it more efficient and more productive in some way.
Yeah. We're doing some work right now looking at labor force projections going out to about 2035. And the situation in the province is highly variable. The Avalon Peninsula, mainly of St. John's and Labrador, they look okay. Labrador looks okay because it pays high enough wages that it's going to attract people, and it is capable of training people for the industries that are there. And St. John's is a big, complex labor market that works reasonably well, and there's lots of opportunities, as you know, we know that because people are moving into St. John's all the time. Where it gets really frightening is in the rest of the province. The South Coast area could see about a 50% decrease in its workforce by 2035, which is astronomical. And the mix of industries, as Kay was talking about, varies hugely across the province. So if you're going to do skill development and you're going to try and keep people in Grand Falls, Windsor, or the Corner Brook area, or St. Anthony's, you have to look at what's there and what could be there and what the current firms are needing and what prospective firms need. And this idea of tailored training is crucial, with apprenticeship programs. The incentives for people to, especially small firms, to participate in apprenticeship programs are not very good, because you wind up training somebody and they finish and somebody offers them $5 more an hour and poaches them. So, it's the short-term rentier phenomenon that I was talking about before. So you need more, I think, government subsidies for apprenticeships, because that takes the apprenticeship program means that you're training somebody while you're paying them. So you're not getting the full value for that period, but you hope that you will down the road. And, the labor force development programs are crucial, and they have to be locally driven, not provincial-wide programs.
Elizabeth Beale, David Vardy, is this something you guys wanted to weigh in on before we move on to the next question?
I would just say, David, that this is an example of what I was talking about in terms of the need for information. This is communication where the public sector can provide really good information on what's happening today. Now, what's going to happen 5 years down the road is highly uncertain. Your crystal ball may be no better than mine, but the thing about it is, let's try to get at least current information out in the hands of young people. Where are the jobs today, and what are the patterns? What are the trends? We need to get that kind of information, and it needs to be in the hands of the kids, it needs to be in the hands of the parents, and it certainly needs to be in the hands of the schools and the colleges.
Elizabeth, did you want to jump in there?
Well, at one point, I would have done a lot of work in this area on labor market information. It's one of the, perennial bugbears of the challenges around the Canadian Constitution, because we don't have a national labor market strategy. The responsibility for education and training, of course, lies with the provinces. And we've really failed to coordinate on labor market information, getting the opportunities, compared to most post-industrial economies. We're back in the dark ages on some of this stuff. And that translates all down to our ability to really act effectively on this in terms of labor market information at the local level. But we can only hope that that this will something that will spur ministers of education on to realize that they've, in this world, they've really got to step up and improve this.
Okay. All right. Kathy, you want to give us our next question, please?
Sure. This one's from Ashley Fitzpatrick. It's often hard for individuals to make personal plans, like starting a new business, or push for a certain change when there's a big government-based or regulatory uncertainty hanging overhead. The future of power rates and public spending on power has been entirely up in the air for years now. As the clear example, I'd be interested to hear from the panel on the significance of this kind of wait and see existence.
A very good question from Ashley, who's a very good journalist and a former colleague of mine in the House of Assembly Press Gallery. And I think this speaks to one of the fundamental and maybe existential challenges that the government is facing. I mean, when you look at the balance sheet, and I know, Dave Vardy, you've had some criticism of the budget and how it's presented, but you can see proportions there, and that the province spends twice as much on debt servicing as it does on the K-12 system, and it's going to add 600, 800 million a year in rate mitigation when the switch goes on Muskrat Falls. So I think we'll get everyone to weigh in on this if we can, starting with Dave Vardy, if you don't mind, Dave, to start us off there in response to Ashley's question.
Absolutely. First, I'd like to say that when you're putting it in the context of Muskrat Falls, you look around the province today and you see people have made their own decisions. They've made their own. You look at piles of wood that people have all around the province. People are building their supply of wood because they're in anticipation of higher electrical power rates. They're installing heat pumps. People are installing heat pumps. People are anticipating that there are going to be large increases in the cost of electricity. Yet there's going to be an abundance of electricity. And so what we're expecting is that a lot of that power, if it's not consumed here, it's going to have to be sold somewhere else, and it's going to be sold at very low rates. So there is a need. And right now we're in a situation where this thing, there's no silver bullet here for Muskrat Falls unless the government of Canada comes along and bails us out by writing off the equity or the guarantee, the loan guarantee, and there's $1 billion that we owe Emera. So
what about if they bought it, Dave? What about if the federal government? What about if the federal government?
If the federal government bought it, that would make
some or all.
Would change the water on the beans totally. It would change the water on the beans. That would be by far our best solution. Government takes it over, and the federal government takes it over. It wipes off the debt. But it's difficult to criticize this provincial government for not having put out policies on what the rate should be because of the great uncertainty. One of the things people don't really appreciate is that the size of our deficit, our fiscal deficit without Muskrat Falls, is about the same as the deficit that Muskrat Falls will bring. In other words, it's about $1 billion. We're $1 billion in the hole on our regular budget. There's another $1 billion to come, okay? And studied this a lot, spent a lot of time on this, got the numbers pretty close. So it's quite mind-numbing. It's mind-numbing. And so we do need to get this resolved, and it's got to be done quickly. This is the number one issue government has got to deal with. There's the Churchill Falls negotiations down the road. We have to prepare for those. But this has to be separated. The Muskrat Falls situation and our relationship with the government of Canada in financing this, and with Emera, this has got to be resolved over the next few months. This is critically important because what's going to happen in the fall is the bills are going to come due, and they're mind-boggling.
So, Kay Riggs, I wonder if you can pick up on that. I mean, because you've outlined a lot of the challenges in trying to bring industry and do economic development in towns that are challenged with capital and human capacity. I mean, how does something like the concerns that Ashley has raised, the uncertainty of a basic expense that every business is going to look at every month on whether or not it makes sense for them to set up in a place, how does it play into the dynamic there?
Well, if we looked at it the other way and said that excess power that Dave says we're going to sell to somebody at a very low rate, could we not use that power to attract business industry to Newfoundland and Labrador? I don't mean to give them the power, but like if we're going to sell it to somebody else for below market rate, could we not use that as an incentive? And I think we'd have to look at the whole business case, and does the business make economic sense, and what's the return on investment over a 10 or 15 year period? But if what we're going to do is to sell it to somebody else for, I don't know, 5 cents a kilowatt, if we said to a company that's expanding, if you expand in Newfoundland, we could provide you power for a period of time at 5 cents a kilowatt. Would that be of any benefit? And I know I can think about all kinds of questions. What about existing companies? Now they're paying full rate. So you'd have to look at the whole part of it. But if we're just going to sell it to somebody else for a below market rate, how can we take it and use it so we get some long-term economic benefit from it.
Yeah, and then the whole question of burden sharing around that and how do you manage that? That becomes another political issue you have to manage. But Kelly Buduk, we talked a lot about processes and institutional weakness, and a lot of that certainly we're seeing the consequences of it now, and this uncertainty about power rates and stuff that Ashley has talked about. Just what are your thoughts on this topic?
I won't say a whole lot here, just because I think that it is a specific topic, but it speaks to an ongoing issue that relates to everything we've talked about, as you said. I mean, there's a fair bit of literature just on, if we're talking about democracies, if we're talking about people needing rights, that things don't develop, they can't possibly develop until people have elements of stability in their lives. And so as much as I would echo this, that this is an important issue and that it needs to be dealt with quickly, because obviously it has all these other ramifications. I don't have sort of clear solutions on that particular problem to present, other than but I would agree with Dave Vardy's point. I don't know how much you can really fault the current government for not attempting to sort of address this problem. I think that but it definitely needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, they are attempting to address it through these negotiations with Serge Dupont speaking for the federal government, and Brendan Paddock as sort of the emissary for Premier Fury. And I know the Prime Minister had said, I think Monday, that they do have a meeting on this scheduled soon. So maybe we'll see some movement at some point in this month. But Elizabeth Beale, I wonder, this uncertainty and this anxiety that Ashley talks about in her question, I wonder if there's a regional solution to this, right? Because the Atlantic Loop is very much a live public policy conversation. I think the hope is that if there is some sort of hydro solution on a regional base, it can bring stability and predictability that can then be used as a pitch to industry to come for reliable power and maybe solve the economic and financial woes of Newfoundland and Labrador to some degree. I mean, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, that would, of course, was the big intention in Emera's participation in the Muskrat Falls development, was to set up a pathway. If you remember back a few years, we talked about, it was New Brunswick who had proposed bringing Hydro-Quebec in to do the same thing, to wheel hydro into the Maritimes to supplant our what we were doing in terms of fossil fuel generation, coal and oil in New Brunswick, and especially Nova Scotia for power generation. So the Emera's role in the Muskrat Falls project was the intent to do that, but also to set up the potential for export. And of course, that's a challenging environment in the long run. The Muskrat Falls has considerable advantage because it's hydropower and because it has a clean premium to it. And that is a very sellable proposition. But in the short run, it's much more complicated, of course, to make that work, and also in particular to make it work for ratepayers in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think Kay's questions about, what's the business case here? If is the right question we should all be thinking about, what are the options? If as Dave Vardy says, everybody's stocking oil because they're so worried about what the impact of rate increases is going to be on individual homeowners, far less business. Then what is the utility likely to lose in terms of customers or demand for its product, and what are the alternatives? So those are the key questions that need to be asked.
And Dave Freshwater, just to wrap up this particular section, I mean, uncertainty is it's kryptonite for investment, right? And you've already outlined the demographic challenges, the labor challenges, the connectivity challenges in terms of infrastructure and the settlement patterns. Not knowing what your power bills are going to be, and if your power bills are going to be affordable, that is certainly a compounding challenge on top of all of that. So what are your thoughts on Ashley's question?
Yeah, and I think there's sort of a fundamental irony in this, in that there's going to be a glut of power, and when there's a glut of power, it should be a reasonably cheap commodity, not a really expensive commodity, because if you raise the price, people aren't going to use it, and you can't store electricity. So I think trying to find a way to make Muskrat Falls not pay itself back, because that's not probably the right way to conceive of it, but to be useful, is important. And you can look at Iceland, you can look at the west coast of Norway, that where you've got similar hydro capacity, and they've managed to attract electric using industries with concessional rates because it's stranded power, and they're developing high value added products. And I would argue that one of the things that the province needs is a stronger manufacturing sector, and manufacturing sector that's based on electricity, given that you've got a big sunk cost in producing this electricity, might be the way to go. Whether you should have done it in the first place, that's another question, but you did. So now you've got to live with the consequences of the decision. And I think decoupling, paying for what is now a sunk cost and making value from that investment are two separate issues, and you need to think about them differently. And while it's, I guess from where I am sitting right now in New York State, there's a suspicion in the Northeast about large-scale hydro. Hydro-Quebec is having a hellish time getting transmission lines into the US. Nobody wants a transmission line, particularly from a large-scale power company. And that's, they can't get permits. And if you can't get it across the border, then Hydro-Quebec's going to be looking to dump power into the Maritimes because that's the only place they've got to dump it. And I wouldn't discount the challenges of getting new transmission capacity across the Canada-US border.
Okay, and that could there will be the catalyst for an east-west electrification, which I know is something the Canadian government and various provincial governments are talking about. Okay, we're out of time. We just enough time for some final thoughts for everybody, and I wonder if we can just end with some quick final comments, sort of in the order we just did that. And so, Dave Vardy, if you'd like to give us your final thoughts on this session today before I turn it over to Rob Greenwood to say goodbye. You're on mute there, David. Okay. Sort of the slogan of the pandemic. You're on mute. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I would just say that there's a role here for the Harris Center, who the people that organize this session, governing the economy. Governing the economy here, it's a big issue, very big issue. I think communications and information and how you can measure the management of government is a big issue, an important issue. I think that would be the point that I want to leave as a follow-up that maybe would come out of this, that we need to put more emphasis on how we can communicate better and allow citizens to understand better what's going on with their government and how they can become involved in making their government more effective.
Okay, your final thoughts?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good. Go ahead. Go ahead,
Okay.
Kenny. Thanks.
Good. I think all we need to do is look at opportunities that capitalize on regional advantages, for example. So, we got a half dozen regions in Newfoundland and Labrador. What makes sense for the region, and what incentives do government need to put in place? I know, the company I was employed with took advantage of the EDGE program that the provincial government had. It was a 15-year program, some tax relief in the early years. It became less, and after 15 years, there's no relief. So, but that was a good program, positive. And then if you add, go back to manufacturing, high users of energy, some relatively low cost power, there's a number of businesses I think that we could attract.
Okay, thank you very much. Kelly, your final thoughts, please.
Sure. I was thinking about some of the things that David Freshwater brought up and some of the other things that have come up today. Some of it takes me back to a number of years ago. I was spending time with one of the MPs in Newfoundland and Labrador. I won't name who, but someone who actually I've written about before. And he was pointing out how in these very small communities, as a province, there's a tendency to sort of think of ourselves as all together, but he was talking about how the federal government had put in money for a new wharf in one of these relatively small communities, and they couldn't really do much in terms of promoting the fact they had done this, because another very small community that was very close to that same community was going to be very upset and ask why they didn't get their wharf too. I think that, for me, a lot of this goes back to, and I think that when we think about the specific government structures, some of the things that, what should we be doing to govern ourselves properly, the idea of the province and the municipalities and everything else, I think that a lot of these things really probably do sort of spell out the ways that we could do things better. For me, I always come back around to what is the political culture? Is it in a position where that's really going to work? Are we thinking of ourselves as fighting against government? Are we thinking as government is a bad thing? Does any concept of a new structure of government, something that might cost more, even though it may have long-term benefits, will people buy it? Right now, everything that I see says no. I think every time that we've seen changes in Newfoundland and Labrador, they tend to be, can we pay politicians less? Can we have less people in the legislature? Government doesn't know what it's doing, so why would we want more of it? So to me, it still comes around to, I think those things are connected. We need to somehow attack that. We need to somehow convince people, again, I know the broken record, we need to convince people that they are their government. They need to figure out how to govern themselves, and that they're tied to this thing. But also that we don't need to fight with our neighbors about it. To the extent that we might have different beliefs about policies, sure, but we do not have to get so sort of sectoral that, the wharf next door is our enemy. We can work on this together, and we can find some common goals. So hopefully that, again, vague, but I do think that there's possibility here for smiles to be on our faces at the end of all this.
A tonal shift could only help. All right, Elizabeth, your final thoughts, please.
Thanks. Well, Kelly's last comment was on a pretty positive note, so that was that was good. I guess I wanted just a final thought is the importance of this kind of discussion and dialogue happening. And I know we don't have everybody from the province listening in, but there's a good crowd, and some great comments that are coming through on the chat line and questions. It shows the importance of having this kind of open dialogue. And I have to say, this is pretty unique for a university to play this role. For the Harris Center, the role that the Harris Center has set up for itself in terms of fostering this kind of dialogue. This doesn't happen every place across the country. It's pretty unique, and it's pretty important in terms of triggering an open dialogue where the opportunities and where all the challenges lie. So I just want to give a little bit of shout out to the university generally for the important role that it sees for itself and being front and center on looking at the future challenges and prospects for the province.
Okay, Elizabeth, thank you. And Dave Freshwater, you were the first person I asked. You can be the first item up for bids. You can be the last item up for bids too.
Okay, so the last word, except for Greenwood. So I guess I'd like to say that the solution to this is going to be people under 30. And it's going to be people under 30 in communities. And a long time ago, I was talking to a class of undergraduates and talking about economic development. And they said, if we have a crappy time growing up in this town, why would we want to stay here? Why would we want to come back here? And one of the advantages that Newfoundland and Labrador has is there's a strong sense of attachment, not just to the province, but to places in the province. And that's sort of been treated as a given. But I think with social media, that's less likely to be a given going forward. You've got to work at giving people, particularly children, as they grow up, a young time and a sense that they can accomplish something meaningful by staying in the province or going and then coming back. And if you do that, I think you'll be fine. If you don't do that, I don't think there's much hope.
Okay, Dave, thanks very much. And I will use my prerogative as the moderator to have my last words. And to pick up on Elizabeth's challenge to be positive, I'm going to try to do that because I am positive. I am positive this is a significant problem and one that the province needs to grapple with. And my hope is that the conversation can happen without brutalizing each other, because one of the things Kelly talks about it makes the political culture of the place is very difficult, and it can at times be quite cruel to people who step forward, and quite vicious to people who criticize government in good faith. And I think that is something in the political culture that I would like to see change, because I think it's a necessary first step towards success in fixing some of these problems. Because, you know, as David Barty says, you have to be able to measure them, you have to be able to define them and describe them if you're going to challenge them and solve them. And I desperately want to see that happen, because I live in Ottawa, but my home will always be Newfoundland and Labrador. And even my 7-year-old, who's lived here since he was 2, calls St. John's home, and desperately wants to come back the minute the coronavirus has gone away and we can get back there. So that's my final thoughts on it. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating. And I turn it over to Rob Greenwood now to wrap this session up.
Thanks very much, David. And thanks again to all our great panelists and our David for doing a superb moderation job, as we knew he would. You know, there's been lots of questions and dialogue, as Elizabeth mentioned, in the chat, in the Q&A. And this will be online for people to refer to afterwards. We couldn't get to all the questions. I noticed Ted Howell had a couple in there. That one metaphor that I particularly like is how our governments often go for home runs all the time. And anybody who's a baseball fan and Moneyball knows it's singles and doubles every day that wins games. And the odd home run is nice, but singles and doubles every day. And every citizen, every organization, every community making a difference every day adds up to a successful jurisdiction. So I think I just wanted to amplify that one. There was also the point about the PERT Commission, and Dave Vardy was a member of that, and how a lot of information was put on the table that can help inform debate. And God bless Elizabeth for highlighting the role of Memorial and the Harris Center. And we really see it as core to our mandate to help get evidence out there for people. It was mentioned about, I think Dave Vardy did, about vital signs. Dave Freshwater has worked with Alvin Sims and Jamie Ward with our regional analytics lab. There's a load of resources at Memorial that we can make available to help inform the discussion, be part of the solution. And we'll continue to do that as we go forward. We have our Forecast NL series that we were about to have a session on oil and gas this week. One of our panelists had to withdraw for personal reasons. We'll come back out of the gates in the fall with that. And we'll have a lot more sessions. Our Citizens Forum panel, we had discussion here about the engagement of Indigenous peoples in the province in these discussions. And our Citizens Forum panel has each of the 5 Indigenous communities in the province represented, as well as from someone from each electoral district. And that's an ongoing process for the next year and a half. So stay tuned for that. We also have a session, the last of ours for the summer, on Friday, which is on a report recently released, done in partnership with the Northern Coalition, which is a group of community-owned fishing companies in the North and in Labrador, most of them Indigenous owned with partners. And so stay tuned Friday at noon for that one. Really want to thank again our panel, David Cochran, for joining us from Ottawa. We look forward to getting you back here in person. Thanks to the amazing team in the Harris Center, Kathy Newhook and her team. Thanks to John Duff and Conferences and Event Services at the Emera Innovation Exchange for online. We can do it in person, hopefully soon, but we can do it online as well. As I say, tune in on Friday for that last session of the week and before summer hits. And we all have a role to play. Can't thank you enough. Let's keep this discussion going, and have a great rest of the day and enjoy your summer. Thanks a million.